As Russian forces consolidate their gain in Avdiivka, more information is coming out about the reality of Russian losses in the battle. And while we certainly can't call it a Ukrainian victory, it's hard to call it a Russian victory either. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So for those of you that have been living under a rock, this is Avdiivka. This is the town that, or what's left of the town, that Russian forces encircled and forced the Ukrainian forces to conduct a withdrawal to pre-prepared defensive lines west. I know my directions, west of Avdiivka itself. Now, what I think is most interesting is that the battle having culminated, there's some loss estimates here. These are, of course, from the Ukrainian military, but I still think it's a really good illustration. And I think actually these are not too far off from the reality, and I'll share why in a second. But the report is that Russian personnel losses, right? So these are wounded and KIA, nearly 50,000 people. This is just an absolutely eye-watering number to lose in combat power, each one of these dots representing 100 people. This is a scale of absolutely unbelievable proportions. Let's see if I can find a World War I comparison. So after 10 months, the Battle of Verdun, right, producing about 700,000 casualties. So I say that because, again, we're looking at just a scale, especially in just 4 months, that's really at least on par with World War I era numbers, right? This is just one side. So a really devastating sign for the Russian Federation. But also what I thought was telling was the number of casualties among armored fighting vehicles, Russia losing nearly 1,000, tanks losing nearly 330, as well as 250 artillery systems and 5 aircraft. So again, this probably makes this the most devastating battle of the entire war. Also worth noting, this casualty figure greater than the entire Soviet losses in the Soviet-Afghan War. So just putting that in perspective, I think will let us see just how tough it is for the Russian military. Now, as I said, this is Ukrainian information, right? So I maintain that I need to vet it elsewhere. But here is another interesting Russian mill blogger publishing on Telegram, where he sort of leaks some of the casualties for Avdiivka. Now, what I thought was interesting is that the blogger himself says that it was actually a Russian military failure. First off, because their goal was to encircle and trap Ukrainian forces in enveloping them and eliminating them. This is a classic tactic dating back to the First World War that the Soviets were often a victim of. They would often raise armies and simply because they lacked the mechanization of the World War II German military, they would often be encircled and eliminated. So that was the goal. And of course, when the war is just ground to an absolute crawl, you're just not going to be able to conduct an encirclement effectively. So as the blogger points out, the losses have just been absolutely eye-watering. And he reports 4 tank regiments have been eliminated, 1 tank regiment, 1 tank division, an entire list of motor rifle units have been ground to almost zero, he says. Literally, he says they were ground down. They were resorting to a point at the end there where their company headquarters would actually go on the attack. They were so out of personnel. And he reports that since October, Russians have taken, quote, 16,000 irretrievable losses, which actually about tracks, because irretrievable, right? If you assume a 3-to-1 KIA to WIA ratio, then actually 45,000 is about the total losses, casualty and wounded in action, and 16,000 would make about right the number of KIA, or killed in action. He also says about 300 units knocked out of armored vehicles. Again, armored vehicles, I don't know if those include tanks in Soviet doctrine. In U.S. doctrine, we'd say just about any up-armored vehicle is an armored vehicle. But if you say armor tends to refer to tanks exclusively. So that is, he's saying about 300 units knocked out of armored vehicles. If he's referring just to tanks, that's also about in line with Ukraine's estimates, right? Now, of course, he says also that Ukraine suffered about 5,000 to 7,000 KIA. So maintaining a 3-to-1 ratio across the course of the fighting. And again, if this is a Russian mill blogger, he's likely got fuzzier information on the Ukrainian side. But this is the only estimate I've seen, and it aligns with the fact that even the Ukrainian armed forces themselves have not acknowledged that their whole intent was to maintain a very favorable kill ratio. And of course, the blogger expresses his fury that ultimately this military debacle, so reckless that it should be taken up by the military prosecutor's office, but nothing is going to happen. And now, this isn't the only Russian mill blogger who's made these kind of statements about the Battle of Avdiivka. A Russian colonel, Pyotr Ilyich, is even more explicit about the failure of the Russian military in the battle for Avdiivka, right? And he sort of couches things. He's mocking armchair generalissimos. That's mill bloggers who, of course, think they know better than the Russian military how to do this fighting. And he's actually mad because they are praising the Russian military, claiming that Ukraine, quote, surrendered Avdiivka or surrendered Artemovsk, which is the Russian term for Bakhmut. And he says those who participated in the assault on these settlements would strongly disagree that either one was surrendered. He points out that even in the late stages of the assault on Avdiivka, Russians still cost many times more lives than the Ukrainians. He says, quote, there are not even whole stones left, describing the state of the town they were fighting over, describing Avdiivka. He says every meter has corpses, blood, and fire. He says, quote, I remember the ugliest lampoons and about how well and bravely it is to fight in iron helmets instead of using full-fledged ammunition. He's referring, of course, to the old style of helmets we've often seen. Instead of using modern Kevlar helmets, many fighters on the Russian military using steel surplus Cold War Soviet-era helmets. Now he says, quote, today no one runs around in iron helmets anymore, not because everyone has changed their clothes, but because the wearers of those iron helmets have run out, literally. Now, here's what's really interesting, guys. If you are a member of combatvetnews.com, you know that's where I drop my my analysis of uncensored combat videos, right? Like the GoPro stuff that I can't publish on YouTube, that you can't find on YouTube. I put it on there. And I do want to shout out all the members. You guys have been awesome. Any one of these tiers gets you access to the combat videos. Of course, I have nothing but love and gratitude to the lieutenant and colonel tier folks who support me at that level. But here's the thing to take away. On Thursday, we did a 15-minute video on a Ukrainian assault unit. These are units that literally drive up to the trenches and clear the trenches of Russians. And I was so perplexed because every Russian didn't have a helmet. And I actually thought that their assault had been so surprising, that their attack had been so decisive, the Russians weren't able to get their gear on in time. But it seemed weird because I was like, I've been on a fob that gets attacked, right? And I was literally like in the gym doing pull-ups. I hear the alarm, and within 5 minutes, I at least have my helmet, body armor, and rifle in hand. I'm ready to take charge, lead my troops. And so the fact that Russians could hear this assault that had been taking place for at least 4 or 5 minutes and still couldn't get a helmet on perplexed me. But it sounds like this is the first time I've heard an explanation that's even more disturbing for the Russian infantrymen, which is that they don't have any more Soviet surplus helmets to hand out. So those soldiers that the assault group may have been fighting may not have even had they may not have not had gear, not because they couldn't get to it in time, but because they literally physically did not have the gear, which is itself sort of fascinating because I wonder, if there are this high level of bodies throughout the front line, as Russia retakes areas, are they going to repurpose the military gear from Ukrainian and Russian forces? I don't know. Logic dictates if I were one of those infantry troopers and I didn't have a helmet and I walked by a KIA who had a helmet, I would take that. And we've seen partisans and other like ambush irregular units do that, where they inflict casualties and then will remove like the plates from a plate carrier or take a helmet or a weapon optic off expressly to put it on their own weapon. So very curious stuff. He also points out, the colonel, that something called Bukhanka is superior to a Hummer, Tiger, and Jeep. You might remember Tigers are the Russian version of an MRAP, a up-armored vehicle capable of surviving. And a Bukhanka, guys, for those of you not keeping track, is the Scooby-Doo van. Yes, this highly capable combat vehicle. Now, don't get me wrong. For ferrying troops and supplies behind the front lines, it's great. But you may notice this doesn't have any armor. This isn't able to stand up to, well, anything. You'd much rather be in a Humvee, a Tiger MRAP, or even just a regular Jeep. Right? The colonel argues that, quote, in no other war has history has every centimeter of vast territories been chewed out like this, and every step has not been so drenched in blood. It's not like a verifiable claim, but certainly I wouldn't be shocked if the artillery density was this great. Of course, he ultimately makes the point that there's nothing heroic about having taken Avdiivka, given the tremendous price that the Russian military has paid, which is a pretty bad sign when your own military has what is the largest victory they've had in years, probably in about, at least since the fall of Bakhmut, what was that? Almost 8-9 months ago. And they can't even now, their own commanders and mill bloggers just can't come out and be like, this was a win for us, right? Anyway, that's all I had, guys. Thank you so much to the Colonel tier members at combatvenues.com. Thanks to the Lieutenant tier members. I link it in the description if you want to become a member and get access to those videos. It's really interesting. And I'll see you guys in the next one.